This audio is recorded by John Loth. It's intended for educational purposes. If you find value in these works, and if you'd like to assist me in the production of these recordings, head over to my website where you can donate as little as $1 to help me continue making these. I really appreciate all your help. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Loth. Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Chapter 5, Part 3. A Community of the Developed Nations. These more immediately necessary changes must be reinforced by a broader effort to contain the global tendencies toward chaos. A community of the developed nations must eventually be formed if the world is to respond effectively to the increasingly serious crisis that in different ways now threatens both the advanced world and the third world. Persistent divisions among the developed states, particularly those based on outmoded ideological concepts, will negate the efforts of individual states to aid the third world. In the more advanced world, they could even contribute to a resurgence of nationalism. Western Europe and Japan. From an American standpoint, the more important and promising changes in the years to come will have to involve Western Europe and Japan. The ability of these areas to continue to grow economically and to maintain relatively democratic political forms will more crucially affect the gradual evolution of a new international system that will likely see changes in American-Soviet relations. Western Europe and Japan offer greater possibilities for initiatives designed to weave a new fabric of international relations, and because, like America, they are in the forefront of scientific and technological innovation, they represent the most vital regions of the globe. Though some scholars emphasize the vitality of European nationalism, the broad thrust of Western European development is toward increasing cooperation and, much more important, toward a European consciousness. For the younger Europeans, Western Europe is already an entity in all but the political respect. Though still anachronistically governed by a series of provincial chieftains, occasionally visited seriatim by the foreign potentate from Washington, their Europe is frontierless, open to unlimited tourism, to the almost unlimited movement of goods, and increasingly to the free flow of students and workers. To be sure, a positive regionalism is yet to mature, but the foregoing at least provides the needed psychological basis for a new Europe. The Technotronic revolution has accelerated the appearance of this Europe, and the autarkic ideas of the industrial age have little or no hold on it today. In Europe, the impact of science and technology, though disruptive within some societies, particularly Italy, which is just completing the industrial phase of its development, has inspired increased cooperation. In Japan, however, which lacks the immediate external outlet that European unification provides for the Western Europeans, and which is subject to a highly visible American military political presence, it has had an internally aggravating effect. It tends to sharpen the nation's internal political conflicts, polarizing public opinion, and rendering the future orientation of the country uncertain. The conflicts between generations, evident in most of the advanced world, have special gravity in Japan, given the cultural upheaval produced by its defeat in World War II, and the only recently achieved balance between its traditions and modern democratic institutions. A revival of Japanese nationalism or a turn toward ideological radicalism would seriously threaten the highly tenuous structure of peace in the Pacific and directly affect the interests of the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. Accordingly, an effort must be made to forge a community of the developed nations that would embrace the Atlantic states, the more advanced European communist states, and Japan. These nations need not, and for a very long time could not, form a homogeneous community resembling the EEC, or the once hoped-for Atlantic Community. Nonetheless, Progress in that direction would help to terminate the civil war that has dominated international politics among the developed nations for the last 150 years. Though the nationalist and ideological disputes among these nations have less and less relevance to mankind's real problems, their persistence has precluded a constructive response to dilemmas that both democratic and communist states increasingly recognize as being the key issues of our times. The absence of a unifying process of involvement has kept old disputes alive and has obscured the purposes of statesmanship. To postulate the need for such a community and to define its creation as the coming decade's major task is not utopianism. Under the pressures of economics, science, and technology, mankind is moving steadily toward large-scale cooperation. Despite periodic reverses, all human history clearly indicates progress in that direction. The question is whether a spontaneous movement will suffice to counterbalance the dangers already noted. And since the answer is probably no, it follows that a realistic response calls for deliberate efforts to accelerate the process of international cooperation among the advanced nations. Movement toward a larger community of the developed nations will necessarily have to be piecemeal, and it will not preclude more homogeneous relationships within the larger entity. Moreover, such a community cannot be achieved by fusing existing states into one larger entity. The desire to create one larger, formal state is itself an extension of reasoning derived from the age of nationalism. It makes much more sense to attempt to associate existing states through a variety of indirect ties and already developing limitations on national sovereignty. In this process, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, on the one hand, and Western Europe, on the other, will continue for a long time to enjoy more intimate relationships within their own areas. That is unavoidable. The point, however, is to develop a broader structure that links the foregoing in various regional or functional forms of cooperation. Such a structure would not sweep aside United States-Soviet nuclear rivalry, which would remain the axis of world military might. But in the broader cooperative setting, the competition between the United States and the Soviet Union could eventually resemble, in form, late 19th century Anglo-French colonial competition. Fashoda did not vitiate the emerging European Entente. Movement toward such a community will in all probability require two broad and overlapping phases. The first of these would involve the forging of community links among the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, as well as with other more advanced countries, for example, Australia, Israel, Mexico. The second phase would include the extension of these links to more advanced communist countries. Some of them, for example Yugoslavia and Romania, may move toward closer international cooperation more rapidly than others, and hence the two phases need not necessarily be sharply demarcated. Structure and focus. The emerging community of developed nations would require some institutional expression, even though it would be unwise to seek to create too many binding integrated processes prematurely. A case can be made for initially setting up only a high-level consultative council for global cooperation, regularly bringing together the heads of governments of the developed world to discuss their common political security, educational, scientific, and economic technological problems, as well as to deal from that perspective with their moral obligations toward the developing nations. Some permanent supporting machinery could provide continuity to these consultations. Accordingly, such a Council for Global Cooperation would be something more than OECD, in that it would operate on a higher level and would also be concerned with political strategy, but it would be more diffused than NATO, in that it would not seek to forge integrated military political structures. Nevertheless, a council of this sort, perhaps initially linking only the United States, Japan, and Western Europe, and thus bringing together the political leaders of states sharing common aspirations and problems of modernity, would be more effective in developing common programs than is the United Nations, whose efficacy is unavoidably limited by the Cold War and by North-South divisions. The inclusion of Japan would be particularly important, both to the internal development of Japanese life and to the vitality of such a community. Japan is a world power, and in a world of electronic and supersonic communications, it is a psychological and political error to think of it as primarily an Asian nation. Japan needs an outlet commensurate with its own advanced development, not one that places it in the position of a giant among pygmies, and that excludes it de facto from the councils of the real-world powers. The regular American-Japanese cabinet-level talks are a desirable bilateral agreement, but Japan will become more fully and creatively involved in world affairs in a larger setting of equal partners. Without such a larger setting, there is danger that the extraordinary pace of Japanese socio-economic development will become destructive. The automatic projections of Japanese growth into the future, made with increasing frequency in the late 1960s, are misleading. They do not make allowance for the destabilizing effect of the impact of change on Japanese traditions. There is a real possibility that in the 1970s, Japan will undergo extremely upsetting internal conflicts unless in some way Japanese idealism is both stimulated and turned to goals larger than insular and personal hedonism. International cooperation involving the sharing with Japan of responsibility as well as of power could provide such an outlet. Such a council would also provide a political security framework in which the security concerns of each state could be viewed in a context that takes into account the inescapable connections between such matters as Soviet policy in Berlin and the Sino-Soviet crisis, Chinese nuclear development and its implications both for Japanese security and for East-West relations in Europe, and so on. Similarly, matters such as Japanese rearmament, possibly even Japan's acquisition of nuclear arms, thought by increasingly large numbers of Japanese to be likely during the second half of the 1970s, could be viewed in terms of this broader significance, rather than as a response to purely local considerations. Indeed, given the nature of modern scientific developments and communications, it is not too early to think of technological cooperation between Western Europe and Japan, as well as between both of them and the United States in some fields of defense. Political security efforts would, however, in all probability be second in importance to efforts to broaden the scope of educational, scientific, and economic technological cooperation among the most advanced industrial nations that are becoming post-industrial and are in some regards moving into the post-national age. The projected world information grid for which Japan, Western Europe, and the United States are most suited could create the basis for a common educational program, for the adoption of common academic standards, for the more organized pooling of information, and for a more rational division of labor in research and development. Computers at MIT have already been regularly conversing with Latin American universities, and there is no technical obstacle to permanent information linkage between, for example, the universities of New York, Moscow, Tokyo, Mexico City, and Milan. Such scientific informational linkage would be easier to set up than joint educational programs, and would encourage an international educational system by providing an additional stimulus to an international division of academic labor, uniform academic standards, and a cross-national pooling of academic resources. Steps in that direction could be accelerated by some symbolic joint actions. Space exploration is probably the most dramatic example of human adventure made possible by science, but currently it is almost entirely monopolized on a competitive basis by the United States and the Soviet Union. The pooling of Western European, Japanese, and American resources for a specific joint undertaking could do much to accelerate international cooperation. In addition, it may be desirable to develop an international convention on the social consequences of applied science and technology. This not only would permit the ecological and social effects of new techniques to be weighed in advance, but would also make it possible to outlaw the use of chemicals to limit and manipulate man, and to prevent other scientific abuses to which some governments may be tempted. In the economic technological field, some international cooperation has already been achieved, but further progress will require greater American sacrifices. More intensive efforts to shape a new world monetary structure will have to be undertaken, with some consequent risk to the present relatively favorable American position. Further progress would in all probability require the abandonment of restrictions imposed by Congress in 1949 and 1954 on the international activities of American corporations and on their foreign subsidiaries and plans. The appearance of a truly international structure of production and financing would have to go hand in hand with the emergence of a theory of international production, needed to supplement our present theories of international trade. Progress along these lines would also facilitate the creation of a free trade area, which could be targeted in progressive stages. The Communist States. The Soviet Union may come to participate in such a larger framework of cooperation because of the inherent attraction of the West for the Eastern Europeans, whom the Soviet Union would have to follow lest it lose them altogether, and because of the Soviet Union's own felt need for increased collaboration in the technological and scientific revolution. That Eastern Europeans will move closer to Western Europe is certain. The events in 1968 in Czechoslovakia are merely an augury of what is to come, in spite of forcible Soviet efforts to the contrary. It is only a matter of time before individual communist states come knocking at the doors of EEC or OECD. Hence, broader East-West arrangements may even become a way for Moscow to maintain effective links with the Eastern European capitals. The evolution of Yugoslav thinking and behavior attests to the fact that the communist states are not immune to the process of change and to intelligent Western initiatives. Slightly more than 20 years ago, Yugoslav pronouncements were not unlike those of the Chinese today. Yet Yugoslavia now leads all communist states in economic reform, in the openness of its society, and in ideological moderation. In the late 1960s, it joined GATT and Yugoslavia's association with EFTA, and perhaps eventually with the Common Market, is a probability. While still committed to the notion of socialism, Yugoslavia's views on international politics are moderate, and they have had a significant impact on communism in Eastern Europe. Similar trends are slowly developing elsewhere in the communist world. To be sure, they are opposed by entrenched bureaucrats. But, in the long run, the reactionaries are fighting a losing battle. Social forces are against them, and the conservative elites are on the defensive everywhere. It is doubtful whether they can reverse, though they certainly can delay, the trend toward a more open, humanistic, and less ideological society. The resistance of those regimes dominated by entrenched conservative bureaucracies will be further weakened if the West views the Cold War as primarily due to the fading, self-serving doctrines of the communist rulers, if it approaches the Cold War more as an aberration and less as a mission. Over the long run, and our earlier analysis indicates that it would be a long run, Soviet responsiveness could be stimulated through the deliberate opening of European cooperative ventures to the East and through the creation of new East-West bodies, designed initially only to promote a dialogue, the exchange of information, and the encouragement of a cooperative ethos. The deliberate definition of certain common objectives in economic development, technological assistance, and East-West security arrangements could help stimulate a sense of common purpose and the growth of a rudimentary institutional framework. For example, through formal links in the economic sphere between OECD and the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, CEMA, in the security sphere between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and through United States-Soviet arms control agreements, or by the creation of an informal East-West political consultative body. A larger cooperative goal would also have other beneficial effects. For one thing, it is likely that the Soviet Union would initially demonstrate hesitancy or even hostility in the face of Western initiative. Therefore, an approach based on bilateral American-Soviet accommodation, as advocated by some Americans, might prove to be abortive and would consequently intensify tensions. But efforts to create a larger cooperative community need not be halted by initial Soviet reluctance, nor can they be easily exploited by Moscow to perpetuate the Cold War. On the contrary, Soviet resistance would only result in more costly Soviet isolation. By seeking to cut Eastern Europe off from the West, the Soviet Union would inevitably also deny itself the fruits of closer East-West technological cooperation. In 1985, the combined GNP of the United States, Western Europe, and Japan will be roughly somewhere around $3 trillion, or 4 times that of the likely Soviet GNP, assuming a favorable growth rate for the Soviets. With some Eastern European states gradually shifting toward greater cooperation with EEC and OECD, the Soviet Union could abstain only at great cost to its own development and world position. Risks and advantages. The shaping of such a community may well provoke charges that its emergence would accentuate the divisions in a world already threatened by fragmentation. The answer to such objections is twofold. First, division already exists, and our present problem is how best to deal with it. As long as the advanced world is itself divided and in conflict, it will be unable to formulate coherent goals. The less developed countries may even be benefiting from the internal rivalries in the developed world, which incite it to compete in extending aid. But since such aid tends to be focused on short-term political advantages to the donor, it is subject to political fluctuations and may decline as the rivalry declines in intensity. Second, the emergence of a more cooperative structure among the more developed nations is likely to increase the possibility of a long-range strategy for international development based on the emerging global consciousness rather than on old rivalries. It could hence diminish the desire for immediate political payoffs and thus pave the way for more internationalized, multilateral foreign aid. While the vexing problems of tariffs and trade with the Third World are not likely to disappear, they might become more manageable in a setting that reduces both the impediments to truly international production and, consequently, a given country's stake in this or that protective arrangement. The underlying motivation for such a community is, however, extremely important. If this community does not spring from fear and hatred, but from a wider recognition that world affairs will have to be conducted on a different basis, it would not intensify world divisions, as have alliances in the past, but would be a step toward greater unity. Its appearance would therefore assist and perhaps even accelerate the further development of present world bodies, such as the World Bank, which are in any case de facto institutions of the developed world, geared to assisting the Third World. A greater sense of community within the developed world would help to strengthen these institutions by backing them with the support of public opinion. It might also eventually lead to the possibility of something along the lines of a global taxation system. More specifically, America would gain several advantages from its identification with a larger goal. Such a goal would tend to reduce the increasing danger of American isolation in the world. This isolation is unavoidably being intensified by the problems associated with America's domestic leap into the future. Moreover, the United States cannot shape the world single-handedly, even though it may be the only force capable of stimulating common efforts to do so. By encouraging and becoming associated with other major powers in a joint response to the problems confronting man's fief on this planet, and by jointly attempting to make deliberate use of the potential offered by science and technology, the United States would more effectively achieve its often proclaimed goal. The quest for that goal cannot, however, be geographically confined to the Atlantic world, nor should its motivation even be implicitly derived from security fears stimulated by a major outside power. One reason for the declining popular appeal of the Atlantic concept is the latter's association with the conditions of post-World War II Europe and with the fear of Soviet aggression. While such a concept was a bold idea at the time, it is now historically and geographically limited. A broader, more ambitious, and more relevant approach is called for by the recognition that the problems of the 1970s will be less overtly ideological, more diffuse. They will more widely reflect the malaise of a world that is still unstructured politically and highly inegalitarian economically. Such an approach would also tend to end the debate over American globalism. The fact is that much of the initiative and impetus for an undertaking on so grand a scale will have to come from the United States. Given the old divisions in the advanced world, and the weakness and parochialism of the developing nations, the absence of constructive American initiative would at the very least perpetuate the present drift in world affairs. That drift cannot be halted if the United States follows the path which it is now fashionable to advocate: disengagement. Even if, despite the weight and momentum of its power, America could disengage itself, there is something quaintly old-fashioned in the eloquent denunciation of the United States' global involvement, especially when it comes from Europeans, who have shown a less than admirable ability to maintain world peace. Moreover, even the most brilliant indictment of United States policy cannot erase the fact that, despite its allegedly long record of errors and misconceptions, the United States has somehow become the only power that has begun to think in global terms and actively seek constructive worldwide arrangements. In this connection, it is revealing to note that initiatives such as the Test Ban Treaty or the Non-Proliferation Treaty were opposed by governments habitually praised by some critics of United States global involvement. This country's commitment to international affairs on a global scale has been decided by history. It cannot be undone, and the only remaining relevant question is what its form and goals will be. The debate on globalism did, however, perform one useful function. Though much of the criticism did not provide a meaningful policy program, the debate prompted greater recognition of the need to redefine America's world role in the light of new historical circumstances. Thrust into the world by its own growth and by the cataclysms of 2 world wars, America first actively promoted and then guaranteed the West's economic recovery and military security. This posture, of necessity heavily marked by military preoccupations, has increasingly shifted toward a greater involvement with the less political and more basic problems that mankind will face in the remaining third of the century. John Kennedy caught the essence of America's novel position in the world when he saw himself as, quote, the first American president for whom the whole world was, in a sense, domestic politics. Close quote. Indeed, Kennedy was the first globalist president of the United States. Roosevelt, for all his internationalism, essentially believed in an 1815-like global arrangement in which the Big Four would have specific spheres of influence. Truman primarily responded to a specific communist challenge, and his policies indicated a clear regional priority. Eisenhower continued on the same course, occasionally applying European precedents to other regions. These shifts were symptomatic of the changing United States role. With Kennedy came a sense that every continent and every people had the right to expect leadership and inspiration from America, and that America owed an almost equal involvement to every continent and every people. Kennedy's evocative style, which in some ways appealed more to emotion than to intellect, stressed the universal humanism of the American mission, while his romantic fascination with the conquest of space reflected his conviction that America's scientific leadership was necessary to its effective world role. Global involvement is, however, quantitatively different from what has to date been known as foreign policy. It is inimical to clear-cut formulas and traditional preferences. But this intellectual complexity does not negate the fact that for better or for worse, the United States is saddled with major responsibility for shaping the framework for change. This point of view is subject to easy misrepresentation and is highly unpopular in some circles. World conditions do not call for a Pax Americana, nor is this the age of American omnipotence. Nevertheless, it is a fact that unless the United States, the first global society, uses its preponderant influence to give positive direction and expression to the accelerating pace of change, that change not only might become chaos when linked to old conflicts and antipathies, but could eventually threaten the effort to improve the nature and character of American domestic life. To sum it up, though the objective of shaping a community of the developed nations is less ambitious than the goal of world government, it is more attainable. It is more ambitious than the concept of an Atlantic community, but historically more relevant to the new spatial revolution. Though cognizant of present divisions between communist and non-communist nations, it attempts to create a new framework for international affairs, not by exploiting these divisions, but rather by striving to preserve and create openings for eventual reconciliation. Finally, it recognizes that the world's developed nations have a certain affinity, and that only by nurturing a greater sense of communality among them can an effective response to the increasing threat of global fragmentation, which itself intensifies the growing worldwide impatience with human inequality, be mounted. There is thus a close conjunction between the historic meaning of America's internal transition and America's role in the world. Earlier in this book, domestic priorities were reduced to three large areas: the need for an institutional realignment of American democracy to enhance social responsiveness and blur traditional distinctions between governmental and non-governmental social processes; the need for anticipatory institutions to cope with the unintended consequences of technological scientific change; the need for educational reforms to mitigate the effects of generational and racial conflicts and promote rational humanist values in the emerging new society. The international equivalents of our domestic needs are similar. The gradual shaping of a community of the developed nations would be a realistic expression of our emerging global consciousness. Concentration on disseminating scientific and technological knowledge would reflect a more functional approach to man's problems, emphasizing ecology rather than ideology. Both the foregoing would help to encourage the spread of a more personalized, rational, humanist world outlook that would gradually replace the institutionalized religious, ideological, and intensely national perspective that have dominated modern history. But whatever the future may actually hold for America and for the world, the Technotronic age, by making so much more technologically feasible and electronically accessible, make deliberate choice about more issues more imperative. Reason, belief, and values will interact intensely, putting a greater premium than ever before on the explicit definition of social purposes. To what ends should our power be directed? How should our social dialogue be promoted? In what way should the needed action be taken? These are both philosophical and political issues. In the Technotronic era, philosophy and politics will be crucial. End of Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. Recorded and edited by John Loth.